Tupac and Biggie were swimming in. And they were both in way over their heads. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit today, kind of give you an overview of the music industry. Now, there's a company in Los Angeles called Music Corporation of America, and it's two guys that move from Chicago, a guy named Jules Stein and another guy named Lou Wasserman. They have a company that represents musicians. They're agents, and they're also in the music business. And then they gravitate towards films. They gravitate towards the representing film actors, and so they have the largest talent agency in Hollywood. And then they get a blanket waiver from Ronald Reagan, who is the president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time. And they are able to be in the production business at the same time they are representing the talent. Now, most of you probably don't follow Hollywood too much, but there's a big movement right now that's happening with writers who have been represented by talent agencies, and the talent agencies package these TV shows and films and basically sell their clients down the river in the packaging. And the packaging is extremely lucrative. And there's a move right now by the Writers Guild to bust up the whole packaging thing because they see it as a huge conflict of interest. And so you have talent agencies today moving into actually being involved in the productions. Okay? There was a book that was written about this. It was called Dark Victory, Reagan, MCA, and the Mob. Now, I grew up in Hollywood, and I produced a dozen low-budget films with Michael Meyer. Michael Meyer was the son of Marvin Meyer, Rosenfeld, Meyer, and Sussman. And Rosenfeld, Meyer, and Sussman was the law firm that represented Universal, Jules Stein, and Lou Wasserman. And one night, I was out to dinner with Marvin Meyer and Michael gets a phone call and is in a fight with his girlfriend, and he's outside on his cell phone talking to the girlfriend. And so that leaves me one-on-one with Marvin. And I just read this book, and I said to Marvin, hey Marvin, talk to me about this. And he goes, Mike, I can't talk about that. Those are my clients. And I said, look, I'm just a young kid trying to figure out how the world works. And so he and I had a conversation where he basically told me how the world works. And the reality is that there are backroom deals that are put together, that all of these things get orchestrated behind the scenes. And Reagan, MCA, and the Mob is exactly how things really went down. And that's a pretty well-sourced and documented book. Well, when it comes to the music industry, there are some pretty interesting connections in the music industry. Jim Morrison is the son of Admiral Morrison. And who's Admiral Morrison? Well, at the time of the Vietnam War, he was the admiral of the entire Navy during the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident. And there are many sources that talk about how the Gulf of Tonkin is a fake incident to precipitate a war. And then you have one of the founders of the CIA, and his name was Miles Copeland. Now, he had 3 notable sons, and those 3 sons are Stuart Copeland, Miles Jr., and Ian Copeland. Now, Ian Copeland used to have a bar. It was called Backstage, and it was located in Beverly Hills. And a friend of mine took me over and introduced me to him, and I started going back there, and I had a deal with him worked out where I would give him advertising, and I'd go over there and eat and drink and what have you, and I'd hang out with him. And one night I asked him to talk to me about his father, and he wasn't going to talk to me about his father, but we started drinking, and we got pretty plowed that night, and I started getting some details about his father. And he told me that night that his father negotiated the hostages out of Iran, so back in the day. And so the CIA, one of the heavy hitters inside the CIA is Miles Sr. Now, who are the 3 sons? Ian Copeland puts together something called FBI booking. And FBI booking was the largest concert promotion service in the music industry. You have Miles Jr., who starts IRS Records. And you have Stuart Copeland, who is the founder of the group The Police. And so they have huge ties into the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are other, connections between intelligence and music. And you have Colin Powell, who comes out here for a big music summit in 1995, talking about rap and hip-hop and trying to steer that. So Colin Powell definitely had his ties into the music industry. And all of this kind of leads to George Bush. Now, one thing that most people don't know is that George Bush Sr. and Jr. both lived in Compton, California. Now, isn't that strange? So before the whole, George Bush running the CIA, and before the Bay of Pigs, and he set up Zapata Oil, but he lived before all of that in Compton, California. Now, he was only there for about 6 months, but why do you move to a place? You move there to establish connections. And some of those connections were probably dating back to that time when George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush was just a kid at the time. They lived in Compton, California. So one other guy that I got to meet through my same friend that introduced me to Ian Copeland was he introduced me to a man named Gia Quinto. And Gia Quinto had worked for Buffalino in the Mafia, and he had become the president of Universal Home Entertainment. And there was a scam that was put on at Universal, and it was a way to launder money, and we can learn something from that scam and understand how it relates to the music industry. Now, the music industry is one of those businesses that's controlled end to end. At least it was until iTunes came on the scene. But before iTunes and before downloads of music, think about how it worked. You had record albums, you had then cassette tapes, and then you had DVDs. All of those need to be produced by a duplicator, okay? And the way it worked with the Gia Quinto saga is that there were payments made from Universal to a duplicator, and then there were records of home video that was being shipped to retailers, and then those retailers would remit payments to Universal for sales of those home video. And so the duplicators didn't actually exist. They didn't do duplicating. Okay, the shipping never actually happened. So that's pure profit. Those are just ledger entries. You never actually had to have the cost of the materials to create the home videos. You didn't have to buy the blank copies. You didn't have to hire the labor to actually master those videos. And you didn't actually have to have somebody driving the shipment across the country to be delivered at a record store or a record chain. And then payments would be remitted to Universal for sales that never happened. And so you're taking drug money that you're getting and you're remitting it to the system and calling it record sales. You're shipping off money to a duplicator, and that duplicator doesn't exist, so you're able to pay out money. So you got money coming in and you got money going out, and that is funding the music industry and the record and the home video industry. Wherever there's a control end to end, they're able to do this, and this was how they effectively laundered money. And that was something Universal was known for. And the Gia Quinto case was really the only one that ever bubbled up, and nothing really ever came of it. And so, I've kind of been on the fringe of all kinds of things, including recently. I was actually the one that drove George Papadopoulos to prison, and I put together a TV show to follow he and Simona around the last couple of weeks that they were, before George went off to prison. And anyway, I ended up, getting cut out of that deal and what have you, and there's, pending legal action and what have you, where I'm a plaintiff. And it's funny how Reginald Wright Jr. always seems to know exactly what's happening in that case because he keeps tabs on it. And, which makes me suspect of the people that I worked with on that, because he always seems to know. But we go back to our story. Now, one question that I have for everybody is, who made Tupac famous? I want you to really think about that. What was Tupac's first real, being thrust onto the highly public stage? Who made Tupac famous? Well, the person that made Tupac famous is kind of surprising. His name is Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle was the sitting vice president at the time. He came out from the pulpit and said, there is no place in our society for Tupac Shakur or his lyrics. Now, a lot of people at the time didn't know who Tupac Shakur was. And I have a lot of friends reaching out to me this week because of what happened with Nipsey Hussle. And all of a sudden, because Nipsey Hussle is in the extremely public limelight of having been murdered on Slauson Avenue, and it's gone viral, his music is now also going viral. And so when you hit that highly public stage, it's that kind of notoriety that makes you famous. And at the time, Tupac really only sold of his first album 500,000 copies, most of which probably came after Dan Quayle made him famous. And so what's going on in the streets, at the time Death Row Records is formed, what's going on, in music? Well, it's a big drug trafficking and money laundering industry. There are drugs that are flowing out on the streets. That money is coming in and it's being used by the intelligence agencies to fund covert activities. And it's also being used to destroy the black family. And if you talk to people who were involved in the inner cities, during that period from, let's say, 84 to, 2000, crack cocaine devastated whole communities. It was a cheap form of the drug that was highly, highly addictive, that once somebody smoked it once or twice, they were hooked and they didn't want to do anything else but get more drugs. And so it led to a hugely lucrative industry. but it also devastated personal lives and families, and there are countless numbers of people who were destroyed in the process. And the social cost of this we are still dealing with today. I mean, you see treatment centers and addiction centers now everywhere. It's very common. And really it has to do with this crack cocaine that was being put out on the streets of America. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of a background about the industry that Tupac and Biggie were swimming in. And they were both in way over their heads. More later.